Hi everyone, this is Mrs. H Psychology again, and we're looking today at the humanistic approach. It is specifically for AQA, but it would apply to other specifications as well. So for AQA approaches, humanism is in paper 2 with the approaches section, and this specific video is really how to tackle exam questions. In particular here today we're looking at a couple of essay questions and how they might phrase them, what you need to do to tackle them. Okay, so if I just bring up the question, let's have a look at that. Okay, so this is from the old AQA, it's actually from Spec B question, but we're seeing some very similar questions for the new specification that started in 2015. So it is still very applicable today. They might give you a little bit of a stem, a little bit of chat between a teacher here in this example. It's from June 08. But the actual question they're asking is discuss the humanistic perspective, in other words, the humanistic approach. In your answer, refer to another perspective. Okay, and this one was a 12 marker. You guys today might get 16 marks for this one. Okay, so old spec AO1s, and they used to call them AO2s. These days we have AO1s and AO3s, but the principle is the same. So you're asked to discuss and make sure you include terminology on the humanistic approach, okay? But then the question is discuss it, and in that discussion you are making these comparisons with other perspectives, and within that you can say which one's better or stronger or weaker or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to show you that, and I'll show you a sort of template. So discuss humanistic, and in your answer refer to another perspective. So key assumptions, obviously, of humanists: free will, self-actualization or personal growth, phenomenology, the uniqueness and the subjective view of the person being more important than objective reality, holism, seeing the whole person within their social context, rejection of science. We've obviously got Maslow's hierarchy and Rogers' congruence between the real and ideal, etc., etc. If you don't know the AO1 material yet, have a look at my video on humanism that gives you an outline, talks through the booklet that I give my students, and it covers all of these in a little bit more detail. And also there is a revision, an exam short answer questions on these key assumptions, which outlines each and explains them. So have a look at that if you aren't familiar with these terms. But for my guys, I'm hoping that you are already familiar with them. So let's look at the comparison. So here we've got a grid further on that I'm going to show you. In terms of AO3s here, I've now called them AO3s for our new spec. 8 marks for the discussion. Remember, that's twice as much, twice as long you should be spending on the discussion than you are on the AO1s, okay? But you're trying to interweave the AO1s within your discussion, and I'll try and show you how to do that. So obviously the discussion is strengths and weaknesses of them, but within that you're also trying to make reference to another approach and bring in comparisons and evaluative comments. Okay, just to draw your attention here, maximum of 7 marks if there's no other approach referred to. So 7 out of 12. Okay, so you're limiting your essay to around about half marks if you don't refer to another one. So it is really important you manage to do that, and you make sure that you do. Okay, so I'm going to show you here humanism versus behaviourists, just as an example. So let's have a look at some comparison points. Okay, so my guys have got a big grid with all the different perspectives, and we've covered various points and which what each perspective feels, or the way they tackle each of these key areas. So here with humanism, as you know, is free will. So what do we mean by that? So again, look at my little video on this, but we should be saying things like, you know, what we mean by that is personal agency, that we're free from coercion and constraint. So try not to just say they're free to choose. You want to develop it a little bit more and have some more terminology in there. You may refer to, for example, with Rogers, with CCT, something like that. But I'll show you how to do this in a moment. These are just the key points. So in terms of behaviourists, they're very different. Obviously, it's an environmental determinism. You might want to pad that out a little bit, develop that a little bit. So referring to stimulus response, and the fact that we're tabula rasa at birth, so a blank slate, and so on and so forth. Another key comparison area is their approach to different methods. So humanists obviously completely reject science. Why would they do that? Because they see everyone as unique individuals. And what's their argument is, why would we study whole groups when we're really trying to work out why one individual behaves as they do? In order to understand someone, we've got to see it from their subjective viewpoint, phenomenology, and so on. So they will, by choice, use case studies looking at small groups or individuals, and we can refer to their methods and the Q sort and things like that if we want to, and Shostrom. Whereas the behaviourists, as we know, are very keen on science. They use scientific methods. They have their scientific steps, so they come up with theories which they test using hypotheses that are operationalized, and they use very controlled objective lab experiments. And you've got examples there from Pavlov and Skinner as examples. Another comparison point you might want to talk about: reductionism versus holism. We know humanists are holistic, so they look at the whole person within their social context. Don't just say looking at the whole person within their social context, so what we call higher levels of examination. In other words, we then can bring in, so not just looking at unconscious, etc., but it's the person within their social context. And sometimes that differs from just the individual person. We know that we behave differently within a social context, so it's important to stress that, as opposed to behaviourists who, as we know, are very reductionist, and they say all our behaviour comes from stimulus-response associations. Is it a positive or negative view? Well, humanists have seen very much as a positive view, really because of this innate drive to become the best that we can be, in other words, to self-actualize. The behaviourists, determinism sometimes viewed as negative perspective, but then we could argue that tabula rasa, that idea that we're born a blank slate and we can become anyone through the result of our environment, one could argue that that is also a positive view. And social views in the past have taken that and run with it in terms of education and things like that. So, it's a bit of a mixture. We've also got a couple of other things in terms of, for example, nature nurture. So we could argue humanists nurture, although we do have this innate tendency. So you could argue it's a little bit of both. Innate tendency, we're born with this drive for self-actualization. So we could argue that's that's nature. We're born with it, but we are also very much influenced by environment. So, for example, Maslow's hierarchy, Rogers' conditions of worth, and that's clearly through nurture, through our environment. Behaviorists very much nurture. Environmental determinism, they think it's all nurture. And we could, if we needed another one, discuss subjective objective. So we know that the humanists are very subjective in terms of their outlook. They believe everyone is unique, and so they believe in phenomenology, that the subjective view of the person is more important than our objective reality. Okay, so again, if you're not sure of these terms, have a look at my short video on that. Whereas behaviorists are very much focused on overt objective methods. Okay, they only want to look at what they can see and measure. They believe that's the only way to really study scientifically, objectively, and further, their evidence scientifically, really. So they are very clearly objective. Okay, so we also might get, I'm going to show you how to tackle this with an example in a minute, but it's a very similar sort of question from Juno 5, a long time ago. Describe and evaluate humanists, refer to at least one other perspective. So this sort of question is quite common. This time it's slightly different balance really between the descriptive and the evaluative. So here in this particular one they had it had 6 and 6, so 6 credits for descriptive material, AO1, and remember their AO2 is now what we call AO3, the evaluation. So a little bit more credit for describing, but very much the same sort of thing. And you can see on the screen here now the mark scheme that went with that. Okay, so it's an old perspective mark scheme, but it's very, very similar. So let me now show you one way that you could build these points, build up these comparisons. Okay, so I'm going to show you a screen of how we would do it with in class and with my students. Okay, so my students are familiar with this layout. It is really just showing you that this end is really, if you're closer to this end, you're really only going to be meeting the lower levels for your essay work, whereas when you're developing it further up, you're along this end, you're actually accessing the higher levels in terms of these essays. Okay, so this is not, this is just a suggestion of how you could start to build up your essay work. Okay, so my guys will have plenty of practice on this, but you can pause obviously and just have a look at what I've written here. I'm just going to go through it to explain it a little bit better. Bearing in mind, I'm trying to keep the time down for you, but just want to outline a little bit of how you can develop it. This is not a perfect answer. These are suggestions. I'm sure some of you could do fantastic work with this, but it is a way to actually access higher marks. Okay, so I'm showing you how to bring in the terminology, how to make comparisons, and how to evaluate. So we need to make sure that we are using key terms. Okay, it's really important that you're doing that. Too many students just use very vague ideas, and you have to show your learning and your precision with your learning. So we could suggest something like this. One key assumption is free will. Okay, what do we mean by that? It means, and develop that a little bit further, humanists believe in personal agency. In other words, we're free from coercion and constraint. We're free to choose, I should say, our behaviours. For example, Rogers' PCT therapy, the therapist acts as a mirror, reflecting back what the client says, but the emphasis is on the client to make choices. And we see this in the Gloria case, okay, which is the picture at the front of this video. So now we're going to go on to evaluate humanism. Okay, whilst this is a very positive view of humanity and humans need to believe they can choose, it is opposed by evidence from determinism or evidence of determinism, and now we bring in an alternative, e.g. the behaviourists believe in environmental determinism. What does that mean? It means that we're the product of all learning from SR, stimulus-response connections, and we respond like puppets to stimuli from environment. You don't need all of that, but it's actually showing that you know about the behaviours. You don't want to spend very much time on the behaviours, but you do want to just bring in a little bit of how they differ. That's what you're doing. So there are loads of different ways you can do this. This is just a suggestion. We could then go on to say, you know, to evaluate really, what do we conclude by these two views? So the humanist view is seen by most as a more positive view of humanity. And to be honest, our legal system is also based on this free will idea, this idea that we take responsibility for our actions. So, you know, we could conclude that that's a more humane view of humans, or whatever it is that you want to conclude with. So it's just showing you're making your comparison and you're still evaluating. You know, you don't need to make an evaluative point. You might feel that you've done enough with that. Depends on how you're going to do it and whether you've got time and how much you can manipulate this information. Second key assumption, let's go with holism. In other words, they study the whole person within a social context. So in other words, higher levels of explanation, and you'll learn that with your issues and debates. For example, Maslow's hierarchy. Okay, so we've got a little bit on that which you can pause and just have a read of. And obviously many see this as positive in comparison to the behaviourists who believe in a reductionist idea, reducing complex behaviour down to their stimulus response component parts. And whilst reductionism allows easier use of scientific testing, because we can identify the stimulus and the response to objectively test it and find causal links, some would argue that it misses the Gestalt notion that the whole is greater than the sum of its part, which is our fuller understanding that we get from a holistic view. So in other words, in order to fully understand humans, we need to see the individual in their social context. Okay, so you're making a judgment really. Third one, we could go with self-actualization. In other words, what it is, and you know how Maslow shows it or how Rogers shows it. You don't need both, and obviously that's a very positive view as opposed to the behaviorists. And you know, we could also bring in some evaluation. And you know, rejection of science is another key assumption, why they reject it, etc., etc. So there are lots of different ways to develop, but it's really just trying to give you an idea of how we make a point, we explain that, we bring in some illustration if we can to support our point, then we go on to evaluate, and here within this evaluation we can either just straightforwardly evaluate the humanists, but here we're also trying to make comparisons And that's where we're bringing in these other perspectives. So you could end up making a judgment which one is better because, but you could just leave it at that point. Okay, so hopefully that will be helpful for you.